Hello. I thought what I would do here is read out or just quickly go through what John Rawls, the foremost liberal political philosopher of the 20th century, thought about civil disobedience. And I'm doing this because there's mass civil disobedience going on in Canada. Truckers are blocking borders in Alberta and Ontario. They are basically occupying the city of Ottawa, making it difficult to drive across. They used to be honking their horns. And a majority of Canadians, 54% of Canadians, now think that the government should put an end to all pandemic restrictions. This was in contrast with it being 39% at the beginning of January, before the truckers. So anyway, John Rawls' essay on civil disobedience is very relevant today. There doesn't seem to be a lot of philosophical justification going on for the trucker convoy, and a lot of the lawyers and the literate and the philosophically inclined and the academics that I follow on Twitter haven't been providing that justification or non-justification for the truckers or defense. So anyway, I'm going to go through what John Rawls had to say on civil disobedience. The first thing that he mentions is that a theory of civil disobedience, the goal of that is to try and help citizens think more clearly about when it is justified and when it is not. And if he can help you do that, if he can help you be more cogent, or if he can help you be more coherent in your philosophy, then he will consider himself to have succeeded. He thinks that a theory of civil disobedience answers three questions. Number one, what is civil disobedience and how does it differ from other forms of government opposition? Two, what needs to be true for civil disobedience to be justified? And three, what is the role and appropriateness of civil disobedience in a constitutional and free society? Number three is the most interesting one, and why I think John Rawls is the perfect philosopher to call upon in this situation, because, well, for people like me and perhaps rebel media as well, we see the pandemic restrictions as arbitrary and an usurpation of the rule of law and of responsible government, and we see these actions as totalitarian. But in my experience, when I try and convince friends of that, they don't buy it, and perhaps with good reason. So you can't pull the totalitarian shtick with the mass majority of Canadians. But John Rawls does something different. He says, when is civil disobedience justified in a nearly just society? And when is it justified in a constitutional democracy? And I think that the vast majority of Canadians would say we are a nearly just society. We may disagree on how we should be a perfectly just society. Some people might think we don't even let Aboriginals have civil disobedience when they are protesting pipelines or water rights. But other people might say we aren't perfectly just because we have these pandemic restrictions. The point here is that Rawls's idea of when civil disobedience is justified in a nearly just society is the perfect frame to address Canadians. And I think that it's perfect to describe what's going on in Ottawa as well. So his theory answers three questions. So first we'll go through his definition of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, to John Rawls, is a public, non-violent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. So, public. If you are breaking the law privately, that's not civil disobedience. When Quebec had the curfew, I would go sleep over at my lover's place, but that didn't count as civil disobedience because no one really knew about it. And Quebec had a curfew at the time, so I was breaking the law, but it wasn't civil disobedience, because the point of civil disobedience is to communicate with other people, to let them know that you oppose the law, you think that it is unjust and that it should end. And you can't do that if your disobedience is simply private. Civil disobedience is also non-violent. The non-violence comes from Rawls saying that civil disobedience is an act of communication. It is like speech. It is like the final form of speech. And if you flip that and if you make it violent, then speech is no longer possible. It's like once you win the fight or even once you punch someone, once you bring in violence, you lose the argument, you lose the debate. And so civil disobedience in Rawls's eyes is seen as a form of communication, even though it might be very strained. It is the last thing that someone can say, a minority can say in a constitutional democracy, to say to everyone else that what is going on is unjust and needs to stop. Conscientious, this means that civil disobedience isn't something that is done lightly. It isn't done because you felt the whim of being civilly disobedient. Civil disobedience has to be something that you take on seriously. It is something that you should be doing after you have spent a lot of time thinking about whether it is the right thing to do. It's done after you've spent a lot of time thinking about the underlying laws and principles that underlie your society and whether those are being broken or not in your view. It is something you take on seriously, and it is a commitment. It's not something that you do on a whim. That's what conscientious means. It's a political act in that, well, I'm not sure. He doesn't define political, but I'm guessing he would mean that it has to do with how we as a polity operate with our laws. Contrary to law, so you would be breaking a law. Civil disobedience is breaking a law. You don't have to break the law that you disagree with to be civilly disobedient. So, for example, if you oppose the draft or if you oppose conscription, that doesn't mean that you have to break that law. You could also do other things like not shoot a gun when you are conscripted, something like that. The point that he makes is that civil disobedience doesn't mean that you have to break the particular law or laws that you disagree with. Usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. Yeah. So the point here that he makes with that last claim, bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government, is that you aren't trying to overthrow the government, you aren't trying to usurp the government, you're trying to change the government's laws and policies. And this is what makes someone who is civilly disobedient from a militant. The militant will not accept the legal consequences of their actions. The civilly disobedient will. And I think that what's going on with the truckers is that they are accepting the fines. They are getting them, and they see that it is a consequence of their actions. But they are willing to take on that burden anyways because they're civilly disobedient. It's what they have to do. So that is how Rawls defines civil disobedience. He defines it as a public, non-violent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. One thing that's quite important to mention here is that he does not think that someone should avoid the consequences, the legal consequences of their actions. So you can't cry when you get a fine for breaking the law. That's what Rawls would say. Like, it's a part of your civil disobedience. And it shows that you respect the law. So that's part one, his definition. To answer his second question, what needs to be true for it to be justified? And he puts forward three conditions. The third one, we'll go through. So he says that these conditions should be ideally met, but they aren't black and white. So these conditions are meant for you to help decide whether it's justified or not. And so for the first condition, he says that the principle of equal liberty has been seriously violated, and or that the equal opportunity principle has been blatantly violated. So in A Theory of Justice, he puts forward these basic rights and freedoms that every liberal democracy needs to guarantee, that every rational person in a liberal democracy would agree with, because from the original position, they would see that everyone wants this. So how does he define his principle of equal liberty? He says that each person is to have an equal right each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. To me, this sounds like he is trying to make a mathematical and sophisticated upgrade of the classic way of saying, the right to swing your fist ends at where my nose starts. So what he's trying to say is that liberty should be maximized for everyone, and the total maximum liberty for everyone, that number is what should be desired. So what this means in practice is that it includes political liberty, which is the right to vote and hold office, public office, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, freedom of the person, which includes freedom from psychological oppression and physical assault and dismemberment, the right to hold personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure as defined by the concept of the rule of law. So if you feel that that the principle of equal liberty, as constituted by those rights that he just listed out, has been violated by the government, then you have met that first condition for justifying your civil disobedience. He also mentions that, the principle of equal liberty is one of his ideas, is one of the principles that needs to be violated. The other one that he considers is the equal opportunity principle, which is defined as social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So I think what he had in mind with this one is that if it feels like there is an unfair system where, a prime minister elects people to join office because they are related to him, something like that, then it would be in violation of the equal opportunity principle. But I don't think that is in question at the moment with regards to the trucker convoy. I think the principle of equal liberty, the first one, is what is relevant here. Anyway, that was the first condition of his justification for civil liberty, or when civil liberty is justified. The second condition is that civil disobedience should be a last resort. So this means that there has had to have been good faith attempts to change what the law was. You could be doing this using protests, you could be doing this using the law and legal recourse and suing the government. You could be doing this through writing letters to your member of parliament and the legislative assembly. You have to do all that you can to exhaust other avenues of changing the law in your society. Civil disobedience is the last resort because all of the other forms don't seem to be working very well, don't seem to be working at all, and that's when you should be bringing in civil liberties, or civil disobedience, sorry. He does say, though, in one part of the text that just because the issue hasn't gone completely through the court system, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be, you don't have the right to, or the justification to civilly disobey. He does say that you still have the right to, you can still be justified in your civil disobedience even if the issue is stuck in the courts. So that's his second condition. Civil disobedience should be a last resort. And the third condition is a bit complicated, and it's hard to summarize, so I'm going to butcher it a bit, but the idea is basically that people who are people who are civilly disobedient all agree that we live in a liberal democracy with a constitution. But if there are multiple groups of people who think that their society is unjust, and they all start acting with civil disobedience at the same time, then this can tear the fabric of this nearly just constitutional democracy apart. And that's not good, because then the civil disobedience would be pointless. So what then do you do? Rawls basically suggests that all of these oppressed minorities should come together and have a lottery system, and they take turns demonstrating their civil disobedience. But he says also that this is kind of impractical. Good thing then that this third condition doesn't really apply to Canada at the moment with the truckers, because the truckers are the number one minority that everyone is paying attention to at the moment. So the third condition doesn't apply. So that is his not justification. That is what he says needs to happen, those three conditions for civil disobedience to be justified. First, has his principle of equal equality been violated, or has the equal opportunity principle been blatantly violated? Second, is civil disobedience a last resort? And third, are there multiple people who are threatening civil disobedience who would then break apart the constitutional democracy? So that is the answer to his second question, which is what needs to be true for civil disobedience to be justified. Now we're going to move on to Rawls's third question with regards to civil disobedience. What is the role and appropriateness of civil disobedience in a constitutional and free society? Let me just read out this quote, which I think is so apropos. By engaging in civil disobedience, one intends then to address the sense of justice of the majority and to serve fair notice that in one's sincere and considered opinion, the conditions of free cooperation are being violated. We are appealing to others to reconsider, to put themselves in our position, and to recognize that they cannot expect us to acquiesce indefinitely in the terms they impose upon us. So then he in this third part, in his attempt to answer the third question, he points out when civil disobedience is appropriate, when it isn't, and he points out that it's only going to work in a society where people are equal with each other. If you live in a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, then you have no right you have no justification to disobey civilly, even if the monarchy is doing something wrong, because the monarchy is above you. As a mere muggle, you have no right to disobey with the monarch. Only God can tell the monarch what is right or wrong. So since we live in a democracy, we don't have that issue. He also says that civil disobedience is an extremely important check on power, just as elections are and an independent judiciary. So it's an important part, and thus they shouldn't be seen as a threat to democracy or delegitimizing democracy. After that, he also says, one big threat of civil disobedience is that you introduce individual anarchy. I think that pandemic restrictions might be wrong, but this guy thinks that they're almost all wrong except for masking. And then the next guy thinks, no, actually they're great. And so if each one of us were to have our own individual sense of what was justified legally and not, then we would live in a state of anarchy where we would be civilly disobedient at different levels, and it wouldn't work out very well. And so what Rawls says to avoid this problem from coming up is that citizens shouldn't be doing this lightly. They shouldn't be doing this arbitrarily. They should be paying attention to how the written constitution has been interpreted through time by courts, because this is why we write written constitutions in the first place, according to Rawls. It's so that we don't have a system of individual anarchy. We have a system where it is broadly known and agreed upon what it is that the underlying principles of our society are. And if you disagree with them, then you can try and change them yourself or move away. But we all have to agree on a certain set of principles. And so before you decide that civil disobedience is what is correct to do in this situation, a citizen needs to look at the principles that underlie the interpretation of that charter or that constitution, and how those principles would be applied in the situation that he faces. If you do so faithfully and honestly, then that is what makes your civil disobedience conscientious and thus justified. If you're just doing this to like create havoc and anarchy and have some fun and bring society down, that's not conscientious, that's not civil disobedience. That's just you being a buffoon. So the last part that I'll mention from Rawls is that the final say of what those the final say of what those foundational principles are and how they should be interpreted rests not with the Supreme Court or the legislature or the executive branch, but rather with the people, because the people are the ones who decide what is acceptable and what is not. If the court says something and the people disagree and they destroy the courts, then that's not very good for the courts. So the people have the final say because they can revoke their consent and bring down the society with these bad principles. So it is the final say is with the people, and it is under their consent that it's basically under the consent of the mob that the court and the executive and the legislative branches put forward laws and policies. If a legal situation, is going to bring in anarchy and strife and civil war, it is the onus for justifying those laws rests on the people who are bringing it in, not on the people who are protesting it, to justify the coercive or abusive laws. And that's how he ends his essays on civil disobedience. So to quickly go over it, he had 3 questions that he wanted to answer. What is civil disobedience and how does it differ from other forms of opposition? And his answer to this was that civil disobedience is a public, non-violent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. The second question that he asked was, what needs to be true for it to be justified? And he put forward 3 conditions. 1, that his principle of equal liberty was seriously violated, or that the principle of equal opportunity had been blatantly violated. The second condition was that civil disobedience was the last resort for this minority. And the third condition was that there aren't multiple minorities being civilly disobedient, which would thus threaten to destroy the nearly just society that they all live in. The last question he had was, what is the role and appropriateness of civil disobedience in a constitutional and free society? And his answer to this was basically that it is an important check on power, just like elections and an independent judiciary. However, it needs to be done soberly by the individuals in it, with great consideration for the principles that underlie the Constitution and its interpretation. It should not be done in a spirit of anarchy. It should be done in a spirit of consideration for these principles and whether they're being violated or not. Lastly, the individuals in a democratic society have the final say on what these principles are, not the courts or the executive or the legislative branches of a society. And that's all from A Theory of Justice. If you would like to read it, I would highly recommend it. You could check it out in his book, A Theory of Justice. I actually read about it in a anthology written by Hugo Adam Bedau called Civil Disobedience in Focus, and that's a great book. I would recommend it because he goes through different arguments for civil disobedience from different people through time, from all the way from Socrates, who opposed civil disobedience, to John Rawls. So you should check that out. And the next video that I will publish is my thoughts on the trucker convoy. So if you want to hear those, Please subscribe and comment if you think that I made a mistake here, or if you just agree with it, or if you disagree with John Rawls's ideas on the justification for civil disobedience. Thanks so much for watching.